Because what happened in the second week of testing in Bahrain was not a simple round of tests. It was the moment when several drivers began to realize something disturbing. These cars do not drive like a Formula One should drive. Raise your foot 500 or 600 meters before braking. Losing top speed due to clipping in the middle of the straight. Manage battery instead of attacking the apex. Simulate a fast lap, and feel that the car forces you not to go to the limit. And when drivers began to express concern, the FIA did not announce a major review. He announced refinements. With 90% of the regulations already closed. The question is no longer whether the 2026 regulation is different. The question is much more uncomfortable. Is Formula One creating a car that its own drivers consider anti-racing, even before the Australian Grand Prix? The second week of testing in Bahrain was the real moment of reality shock. Until then, the 2026 regulation existed in simulators, in technical documents, in presentations full of promises about sustainability, agility, and spectacle. But when the cars took to the track with more demanding programs, when the long runs and representative simulations began, the discourse changed. Because it is one thing to read that there will be greater electrical dependence, and quite another to feel it lap after lap. In Sakir, several drivers began to detect a worrying pattern. Energy management was not a complement to driving, it was the central axis of the car's behavior. To complete a competitive lap without compromising the total energy available, they had to lift the accelerator between 500 and 600 meters before certain braking. Not by strategy. Not for extreme conservation. But because the concept demanded it. That completely alters the nature of the attack. Instead of braking to the last meter, the pilot is forced to anticipate, to calculate, to soften. The natural aggressiveness that defines Formula One begins to dissolve into a constant energy equation. And the most disturbing thing was that this did not only happen in race simulation. It was also perceived in fast lap attempts. The phenomenon of clipping in the last meters of the straight, that loss of electrical power when the hybrid delivery is exhausted, caused obvious cuts in top speed. The feeling inside the cockpit was no longer that of having a constant missile under your right foot, but rather that of managing a battery with an expiration date every few seconds. That's where the real discomfort began. It wasn't just discomfort, it was a question of identity. Some drivers began to describe the experience as closer to an electric category than to traditional Formula One. Not because the car was slow, the total power is still high, but because the way it is delivered forces a radical change in driving style. And that has direct consequences on the show. If both drivers are constantly managing energy, if they must lift before braking, if they depend on an electrical boost conditioned by the distance to the rival, the real margin to attack and defend is narrowed. The wheel-to-wheel battle stops being a purely question of talent, bravery, and precision, and begins to be conditioned by predefined energetic windows. The tension increased even more when, in the middle of that second week of testing, the Formula One Commission met in Bahrain and agreed on refinements to the regulations that will be submitted to the World Motor Council. That is to say, while the pilots were discovering the limits and problems of the concept on the track, the regulatory framework was moving towards its consolidation. The FIA launched a specific survey of drivers to measure the level of discontent. A gesture that, on paper, sounds conciliatory. But from within it was interpreted with skepticism, because the parallel message was clear. 90% of the regulatory work has already been done. In other words, it can be adjusted, but it cannot be redesigned. That nuance is crucial, because for several pilots the problem is not a small technical detail. It is the central philosophy of the car. It is the feeling that the regulation prioritizes energy efficiency over competitive instinct. And all this happens just before the Australian Grand Prix. Bahrain's second week not only redefined performance expectations, it exposed a crack between the regulator and the pilots. A rift that does not revolve solely around lap times, but something much deeper. What it must feel like to drive a Formula One. And when those inside the cockpit begin to question that feeling, the conversation stops being technical and becomes structural. After the second week of testing in Bahrain, the discomfort stopped being an isolated comment among engineers and became a collective discourse within the paddock. It was no longer a simple technical adaptation. It was a concern shared by several profiles on the grid. The more experienced pilots began to raise the tone, not because the car was slow, not because it was impossible to drive, but because they felt that the concept was altering the nature of combat. The term that began to be repeated was anti-racing. And he was not referring to a lack of artificial spectacle, but to something deeper, the way in which energy conditions each phase of the return. When electric power represents such a dominant part of the total performance, The driver stops managing only tires, braking, and lines. Start managing battery percentages, delivery peaks, and exact deployment times. That changes the mentality in combat. In a traditional overtaking, the driver calculates the line, traction, braking point, and the rival's defense. Under the concept that was experimented in Bahrain, you must also calculate if you have enough energy to complete the movement without running out of deployment in the middle of the next straight. That uncertainty does not generate aggression, generates caution. And in a sport where the margin is millimetric, introducing structural caution can completely transform the dynamics of the race. Another critical point was the concern in departures and relaunches. With a power balance so dependent on the electrical part, delivery peaks can create abrupt differences in acceleration depending on the energy state of each car. That adds an extra variable in already delicate moments. At the same time, the political moment inflamed tempers even more. The F1 Commission decided to move forward with refinements to the regulations just as the drivers were digesting what they had discovered on the track. The internal feeling was that the regulatory structure was advancing faster than the sporting consensus. Yes, there was a survey. Yes, there was openness to adjustments. But the message that 90% of the work was already closed outweighed any conciliatory gesture. For many drivers, that meant one thing. They may iron out edges, but the core concept won't change. And therein lies the true core of the conflict. The FIA defends a more sustainable regulation with greater energy efficiency, with slightly smaller cars and modern technologies that project Formula One into the future. The pilots, on the other hand, are defending a sensation, that of absolute control, pure aggressiveness, the freedom to attack without depending on predefined energy windows. It is not a discussion of tenets. It is an identity discussion. The second week of Bahrain made one thing clear. The gap between regulatory vision and real on-track experience is deeper than it seemed. And when that gap opens before the new regulatory cycle even officially begins, the tension doesn't go away, it builds. Now the championship is about to start. But beneath the surface there is already a silent battle. A battle between efficiency and essence. And that battle can set the course of Formula One long before 2026 officially arrives. What the second week of testing in Bahrain left behind was not a simple list of technical complaints. It was an early warning that the transition to 2026 may not be as harmonious as the FIA had hoped. Because when the drivers got out of the car in secure, they weren't just talking about balance or setup. They were talking about sensations. And in Formula One, feelings matter as much as numbers. The 2026 regulations promise lighter cars, active aerodynamics, greater electrical prominence, and tools such as the manual override to facilitate overtaking. But on the track, what was felt in Bahrain was something else. A Formula One where the driver gets up early, where clipping limits the final attack on the straight, where energy management prevails over instinctive aggressiveness. That's not a simple style adjustment. It is a transformation of competitive DNA. And the timing chosen to introduce refinements to the regulations just after the drivers experienced those limitations in the second week of testing added an inevitable political component. The perception was clear. The general framework has already been decided. There will be tweaks but no redesign. That puts pilots in an awkward position. Adapt? Or accept that the Formula One they knew is evolving into something different. The tension did not explode publicly in the form of an open breakup. But it did filter through into harsher statements, into internal paddock commentary, and into a shared sense that something fundamental is changing too quickly. Now the calendar moves to Australia. The championship begins. But beneath the surface there is a question that can no longer be ignored. If the driver should think more about energy than attacking the apex, is Formula One still the pinnacle of pure driving? The second week of Bahrain did not define who will be fastest in 2026. It defined something more important. He defined that there will be resistance. And when the protagonists of the show feel that the concept does not represent the essence of the sport, the conflict does not disappear with the start of the season. It moves, it intensifies, and it can become the great structural debate of the new era. The second week of testing in Bahrain did not leave headlines for spectacular times or unexpected revolutions on the table. It left something much deeper, a feeling of rupture between those who design the future of Formula One and those who drive it to the limit. Pilots are not questioning sustainability. They are not rejecting technological evolution. They are questioning what it feels like to compete. When a pilot has to lift 500 or 600 meters before braking. When clipping conditions the end of a straight. When energy management outweighs the attack instinct. Then the conversation stops being technical. She becomes philosophical. The FIA moved forward with refinements and made it clear that the bulk of the regulations are already defined. The implicit message is that 2026 will move forward under this energy architecture. And that puts the drivers before an inevitable reality, adapting to a new type of Formula One. But the big question is whether this new Formula One will retain the essence that made it the pinnacle of motorsport. Bahrain was no simple winter test. It was the first real clash between regulatory vision and on-track experience. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.